Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, the terrorist attacks that we have seen over the last couple of months, including those tragically in Paris and in San Bernardino, California, have made it all too clear that terrorist threats to Americans and to our allies are very real. I believe the best way to combat the threat of ISIS across our globe is to continue to degrade and destroy their forces overseas and show the world that they're not as powerful as they claim to be. Our success will not only rob them of their safe haven, but will also undercut their recruitment narrative that ISIS is on the rise. But in addition to destroying ISIS overseas, we must also focus on defeating the threat of ISIS here at home. Now, I realize that many Americans, Mr. President, and many of our colleagues are concerned about terrorists traveling to our borders as refugees from Syria or maybe some other country. As many of my colleagues may recall, late last year, we debated the question regarding the resettlement of 4 million Syrian refugees and whether we in this country should open our doors to even a small fraction of them. We debated actually right here on the Senate floor, as some of you will recall. We debated it at our committees, including the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, where I serve as the senior Democrat. And during that debate, I was reminded of the words of Pope Francis' historic and moving address just at the other end of this building, the Capitol over in the House chamber, when he said in a joint session address to Congress last fall, he said during his remarks, he reminded us all of the Golden Rule. In fact, I think it was more applause when he did that, to treat other people the way we want to be treated, to love our neighbors as ourselves. And he also invoked, some of you may recall, Matthew 25, which deals with the least of these. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was thirsty, did you give me to drink? When I was a stranger in your land, did you take me in? Now, I think we have a moral imperative to provide for the least of these. But at the same time, we have a moral imperative to protect Americans from extremists who may seek to come to the United States to cause us harm. As we learn to address this tension, our nation has rigorous screening procedures in place for all refugees, as well as enhanced screening for refugees that might be coming here from Syria. It's a process that takes an average of 2 years to complete. And I might say, just for those who aren't familiar with the process, people, in this case, 4 million refugees have left the fighting in Syria to try to get away, to save their lives. They end up in refugee camps in that part of the world. And the United Nations has a special mission, which includes to vet them, to get to know them, to talk with them, and to see if they would like to stay in a refugee camp or try to get settled into some other country. In vetting the 4 million refugees, a small fraction of those are folks who had indicated that they would be interested in maybe resettling in this country. And at the end of the day, after winnowing down from 4 million refugees, I believe that the UN sent us, I think, 7,000 names. And out of the 7,000, we selected 2,000. Mostly kids, mostly young families, mostly old people, not very many men of fighting age, if you will. But the President has called for increasing that 2,000 to something like 10,000 over the next year, the course of this year. Think about that. Out of 4 million, what percentage of 4 million is 10,000 people? Even if we took them all, if we took all 10,000, and it's 1/4 of 1%. That's what it is, 1/4 of 1%. And there are obviously concerns about whether any of those people are dangerous, pose a danger to us, imminent danger to our people. I would just have us keep in mind that 2,000 have come in the course of the last year. Not one of them's been arrested. Not one of them's been convicted of terrorist activity, plotting or trying terrorist activity. And one of the reasons why that happens is if I were an ISIS person and I were in Syria and I wanted to get over here, I sure wouldn't spend 2 years trying to come through with refugees. That's the most stringent vetting of any group of people that want to come to this country. They have to undergo biometric checks. They're interviewed by people who are trained, not just by the UN, but also by us overseas. They're vetted by people, interviewed by people who are trained to detect deception. We have the ability to check these people against any number of databases which relate to potential terrorist activity. So if I were an ISIS person wanting to embed myself with a terrorist group, I'm not going to wait 2 years to do that and face the most rigorous vetting process of anyone trying to come to this country. For those of Syrian descent, the process could be even longer than that. And it's a long time to wait for terrorists if they were going to try to use the refugee program to access the U.S. If I were a terrorist trying to come here, the last thing I'd do is go through those 2 years of vetting. And while I understand my colleagues' concern, the refugee bill that we dealt with today will do little to address our nation's security needs. And that's why many of my colleagues joined me in opposing this bill. The bill that was before us would require the head of top national security agencies to personally certify that each refugee from Syria and Iraq poses no security threat before admission to the United States. Not now, not ever. If this bill had passed, it would have served as a backdoor way to shut off the refugee program by requiring our national security leaders, head of the FBI, Director of National Intelligence, Secretary of Homeland Security, to promise something they would never promise. As currently drafted, this bill would require these three national security leaders to guarantee that the refugee will never become a security threat. That is not how these leaders or their organizations evaluate security threats. They don't have a crystal ball, and they cannot predict the future. Simply put, the SAFE Act would effectively stop the resettlement of fully vetted refugee women, children, families, older folks from Syria and from Iraq, and weaken our national security. Again, that's one of the reasons why I believe we must focus our attention on threats that pose a greater risk to our homeland. Democrats put forward a series of common sense solutions, alternatives if you will, that would strengthen our security and help protect us against ISIS, a couple of which I had the pleasure of co-authoring. Instead of vilifying refugees, the proposals that we put forward impose tough new sanctions on financial institutions if they knowingly facilitate financial transactions with ISIS. That particular proposal closes loopholes that would let terrorists legally buy guns. This bill improves intelligence sharing with our allies who join us in the fight against ISIS. The bill also includes several provisions to better protect the homeland. For example, the bill, our proposal strengthens the security of our airports. The bill provides better training for law enforcement to respond to active shooter incidents. The legislation also makes several improvements to the security of low-level radiological materials so that potentially dangerous material does not fall in the hands of terrorists who might use it to create a dirty bomb. One particular area that I want to focus on, though, is countering violent extremism. As the tragedy in San Bernardino, California underscores, one of the greatest threats that we face is homegrown terrorism and self-radicalization. And that's why the Democratic alternative includes language from legislation that I introduced that would strengthen the Department of Homeland Security's ability to counter violent extremism here in the United States. This proposal authorizes a new office charged with helping communities across the country, Muslim communities across the country, stop their young people from being recruited by ISIS. The legislative proposal would also create a grant program that would help the Department of Homeland Security to work with nonprofits, with local officials, with religious leaders and youth groups to work together to counter the narratives offered by terrorist groups like ISIS. Mr. Chairman, if you look in the recent years at the folks in this country that are inspired by ISIS to commit terrorist activities against those of us in this country, you won't find them having come over and embedded, to my knowledge, with any refugee organization or any refugee group. The biggest threat to us is not that. It's not people necessarily coming through on the visa waiver program or student waiver programs or student visa programs or tourist visa programs. The biggest threat to our security here is folks that, in many cases, were born here, or in some cases, folks who came from, they could have come from Syria, they could have come from Iraq or some other place, but they came here and became radicalized after coming here, maybe after becoming a citizen here. Those are the threats that I think pose the greatest danger. We call them lone wolves. And one of the best ways to address those folks is to see if look around at our history and maybe at other countries, what's going on in other countries, and see, is there some way to reach out to those people who are actually in danger of becoming radicalized or becoming a lone wolf? Is there some way we can reach out to them and reduce the likelihood that they're going to be radicalized and take out their frustration, their anger on people in this country in harmful ways? When I was governor of Delaware, my last year as governor of Delaware, I was involved in standing up a foundation. It was called the American Legacy Foundation. It's funded by a tobacco settlement between the tobacco industry and all 50 states. And the idea behind the American Legacy Foundation was to use this $1 billion that was provided to the American Legacy Foundation to develop ways to message, communicate with young people in this country who either were smoking or were thinking about becoming smokers. And some of us remember as our youth, the idea of smoking when I was a kid growing up was actually something was thought to be a desirable thing. We're not aware early on about the health consequences to it. And so you can see on television and all kinds of advertisements and commercials, people smoking. And say, oh, that would be a cool thing to do. Well, the American Legacy Foundation comes along in 2001 and develops a counter message to all that. And we called it the Truth Campaign. The Truth Campaign. And the Truth Campaign was a multimedia campaign. It included radio and TV commercials. It included the internet. It included magazines, that sort of thing, that young people read or the young people listened to. And it wasn't the narrative and the messaging communications were not developed by the board members like me. They were not developed by the paid staff of the American Legacy Foundation. They were developed by young people. And that it could have been 11 or 12 or 13 or 14, 15, 16, 17, 18 years old who developed the narrative and said, this is a message you need to send out through all these different medium to try to convince them not to smoke, or if they're already smoking, to quit. And that's what we did. And it's amazing if you look at the incidence of smoking among people that are like preteens and teenagers in the country, what it was in 2001 and what it was by the end of the last decade. It's amazing how well it worked. Amazing how well it worked. It was called the Truth Campaign, hard-hitting. The messages developed by really our target audience. There's a saying when I went to business school, ask your customer, talk to your customer. What do they want? And in this case, we talked to our customers. A lot of people about the age of our pages that are sitting here today. The Department of Homeland Security has stood up, was attempting to stand up an office they call it the Office of Community Partnership. And it's an office that would work with the Muslim community across the country, with families, with religious leaders, with other young people, in order to try to make sure that the young people do not become radicalized and undertake activities that are going to harm other folks in this country. I think it's a very promising initiative. A very promising initiative. And we're putting in touch the folks at the Department of Homeland Security who are leading this effort, the partnership office, and with the American Legacy Foundation to see what worked in really changing the game with respect to young people smoking in this country, using tobacco in this country, and how to see if there's some lessons that might be available to us for trying to deter the likelihood that people of Muslim faith will somehow be convinced that their faith directs them to undertake these violent activities. I'm encouraged by this prospect. The last thing I'll say is we've got about 1.5 million people, 1.5 billion people around the world who are Muslims. And they believe, well, I'm Protestant, and we have people in here in a different faiths in this body, Protestants, Catholics, Jews, others. Among the things we have in common, as well as with the Muslim faith, is something I mentioned earlier. It's the golden rule. Almost every major religion on earth, has several things in common. But one of the things they have in common is the golden rule. Love our neighbor as ourselves, to treat other people the way we want to be treated. I don't care if you're Protestant, Catholic, Jew, Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim. Somewhere in your sacred scriptures is that idea, that notion, that directive. And there are some people who take my faith, Christian faith, and they just turn it on its head to say and to do things that we never do, we should never do. We take the Bible and the Old Testament and the New Testament, and instead of embracing Matthew 25, the least of these, when I was a stranger in your land, did you take me in? To basically say, we're not going to let any people in this country of, we'll say, the Muslim faith. That's not a Christian thing to say or do. And people take my religion, my faith, and they turn it into something that's not even close to being. And not surprisingly, there's some people who do that with the Muslim faith. And we need to counter that and help a lot of people, the vast majority of folks who are Muslim in this country, to help them better counter that in ways that, frankly, I could never do, but in which people in Muslim community, that faith across the country, would like to do and want to do. And we need to be a good partner to help them to be successful in that effort. Doing that, frankly, is a whole lot better alternative than the legislation that was before us today. And that's one thing we ought to be able to agree on. And I hope my colleagues, Democrat and Republican and Independent, will find it a path to joining me and others who think this is a good idea and join us in making it happen.